The crucible that would transform Haji Ayub Afridi from a regional player into a global narcotic sovereign was not of his own making, but was forged in the fire of geopolitics. The year was 1979, and the Soviet Union's tanks rolled into Afghanistan, triggering a conflict that would redefine the world. In response, a covert alliance of American CIA and Pakistani EC operatives funneled billions of dollars in cash and weapons to the Afghan Mujahideen resistance fighters. This pipeline of support ran directly through Pakistan's tribal area, with Peshawar and the Khyber Agency becoming the central hubs. For the pragmatic strategists in Washington and Islamabad, the primary objective was bleeding the Soviet bear. The secondary, unintended consequences were someone else's problem. Into this volatile landscape, Ayub Afridi stepped with the instinct of a born opportunist. He saw not just a war, but a perfect storm. The CIA needed a secure, deniable logistics network to move arms and money. The Mujahideen, operating from remote bases, needed a steady, untraceable revenue stream to fund their jihad. The local tribes, including his own, demanded economic benefit for allowing their lands to be used. Afridi positioned himself as the indispensable nexus. His established smuggling corridors, honed for centuries for everything from spice to electronics, became the secret highways for Kalashnikovs and Stinger missiles. In return, he gained something far more valuable than payment in dollars: unassailable protection and political carte blanche. The very agencies fighting a superpower war turned a blind eye to his other enterprises, and it was here that the opium poppy, traditionally grown in small plots for local use, found its grim destiny. The war had devastated Afghanistan's agricultural economy. Opium was a high-value, low-bulk crop perfect for a war zone. Farmers were encouraged to cultivate it as a revolutionary tax. Afridi, with his now supercharged network, began systematically organizing its collection. He provided advances to farmers, set up primitive labs in the tribal areas to process gum into morphine base, and used his weapon smuggling routes in reverse. The Mujahideen's donkeys that carried missiles and now carried opium out. The geopolitical shield was absolute. He was no longer just a smuggler, he was a strategic asset, a logistics kingpin in a proxy war, and his narcotics operation was piggybacking on the most expensive covert campaign in history. This period birthed the legend of the Afghan Heroin King, for it was under the umbrella of a CIA-backed jihad that his empire was conceived, protected, and allowed to grow with terrifying speed and impunity. By the mid-1980s, Haji Ayub Afridi's operation had evolved from an opportunistic wartime sideline into a vertically integrated, multinational heroin conglomerate with a boardroom-like efficiency, albeit one where meetings were held in mud fortresses guarded by men with rocket launchers. His genius lay in his organizational mastery and his understanding of market forces. He didn't just traffic heroin, he industrialized it. In the remote valleys of the tribal areas, and across the border in Afghanistan, he financed and established a network of sophisticated laboratories moving beyond basic morphine base to refining high-purity heroin, some reaching a staggering 90% purity, a quality that would dominate and devastate Western markets. These labs were mobile, often set up in sprawling nomadic camps or camouflage within mountain caves, making them nearly impossible to detect or raid. He employed chemists, some allegedly from Europe, paid exorbitant sums to oversee production, but his true innovation was in logistics and scale. Afridi leveraged his deep tribal connections to create a seamless, loyalty-bound supply chain. Clan elders were given hefty percentages to ensure a safe passage through their territories, binding them to his fortune. He operated a fleet of vehicles from rugged four-wheel drives to large trucks with hidden compartments engineered by master craftsmen. These convoys moved under the cover of darkness or, with breathtaking audacity, in plain sight, protected by the pervasive corruption he cultivated. His reach extended into the very ports of Pakistan. Through a web of bribes and partnerships, he gained influence within the Karachi Port Trust and customs authorities. Shipping containers, meticulously documented, with false bills of lading for legitimate goods like textiles or rice, would be loaded with tons of heroin, sealed, and placed on cargo ships bound for Europe and North America. This wasn't small-time smuggling. This was containerized global trade in death. His European distribution network, primarily run through Turkish and Balkan criminal groups he partnered with, ensured the product flowed into the veins of cities from London to New York. The sheer volume was incomprehensible. Law enforcement agencies would later estimate that at his peak, Afridi was responsible for supplying nearly half of the heroin entering the United States. The profits were beyond accounting, literally. Billions of dollars in cash flowed back, not through banks, but through the ancient Hawala system, an informal trust-based money transfer method ideal for moving vast sums without a paper trail. This money then bought more political protection, more weapons for his private militia, and more investment into legitimate fronts, like real estate in Peshawar and Karachi, allowing him to launder his wealth and build an aura of respectable, pious philanthropy. He was now a statesman of the shadow world, a CEO of a corporation whose product was addiction and whose market was the planet. The opulent fortress of Haji Ayub Afridi, however, was built on foundations of sand, and the geopolitical winds that had once shielded him began to shift with violent suddenness. The beginning of his end can be traced to February 15, 1989, when the last Soviet soldier left Afghanistan. The war was over. For the CIA and ISE, their strategic asset, the Mujahideen, had served its purpose. The flood of money and arms flowed to a trickle, and with it, the blanket of immunity that had covered all activities in the tribal belt began to fray. The West, particularly the United States, now had to confront a monstrous unintended consequence of its proxy war, a perfectly formed, globe-spanning heroin apparatus that was fueling a devastating addiction epidemic at home. The war on drugs, championed by American President Ronald Reagan, now turned its full, frustrated gaze towards Pakistan, and the legendary king of heroin, Ayub Afridi, had become an acute political liability for the Pakistani government as well. International pressure, especially from the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, which had been painstakingly building a case, was immense. The sheer scale of Afridi's operation was an embarrassment, exposing the deep state complicity and corruption that had allowed it to flourish. The first major crack appeared not with a direct attack on Afridi, but through the relentless, patient work of international narcotics agents. In 1988, a joint DEA and Turkish police operation intercepted a massive shipment of Afridi's heroin in Istanbul, leading to arrests and, crucially, informants. Wiretaps and surveillance began to paint a comprehensive picture of his network. Then, in 1990, the U.S. authorities scored a pivotal victory. They arrested and flipped one of Afridi's key European distributors, a Turkish crime lord who provided detailed ledgers, shipping routes, and names. This intelligence allowed for a series of devastating interdictions across Europe, seizing tons of product and cutting off vital revenue streams. Back in Pakistan, the political landscape was also turning against him. The new civilian government, eager to prove its legitimacy to the West, could no longer afford to harbor the world's most wanted drug baron. The IIC, his former protectors, found his notoriety counterproductive to their new regional aims. Afridi's once impenetrable armor of tribal loyalty also showed signs of strain. The astronomical wealth had created jealousy and dissent within the Afridi clan and among rival tribes. The Pakistani authorities, under direct orders from the highest levels and with covert logistical support from American intelligence, started planning a move that was once considered unthinkable, a military operation in the Tira Valley to capture Haji Ayub Afridi. The hunter was now being hunted, and the mountains that had been his sanctuary were about to become his trap. The downfall was set in motion, not by a single error, but by the cold, recalibrating logic of geopolitics that had first created him. The net, woven across continents over years of investigation, finally closed around Haji Ayub Afridi in the early months of 1991. The operation to apprehend him was a delicate and dangerous military endeavor, code-named and classified, reflecting the target's near-mythic status. It could not be a simple police raid. It required the force of the Pakistani army, yet executed with the precision of a special forces mission to avoid triggering a tribal war. The planning involved extensive surveillance, bribes to lower-level clansmen for information on his movements, and the selection of a moment when his formidable personal militia, a small army of well-armed tribesmen, might be at a relative disadvantage. The chosen day was one when Afridi was reportedly at his primary fortress-like compound in his native village in the Tir Valley, a region so remote and hostile that government authority had rarely been projected there with any success. Under the cover of darkness, a large contingent of Pakistani Frontier Corps and Army commandos, guided by intelligence from both the ISI and likely informants cultivated by American agencies, surrounded the area. They established a tight cordon blocking the legendary escape routes through the mountains that Afridi knew like the back of his hand. As dawn broke, the forces moved in. What followed was not a dramatic gun battle, but a tense, negotiated surrender. Afridi, realizing he was completely encircled and that firing the first shot would lead to the annihilation of his household and likely severe retaliation against his wider tribe, made a calculated decision true to the Pashtun code of Nanavatai, sanctuary. He could have appealed for a tribal gathering, but the presence of the state's military muscle made that tradition void. He walked out, not as a defeated chieftain in chains, but with a stoic dignity, facing the authorities who had once been his tacit partners. His arrest sent shockwaves through the criminal underworld and the corridors of power in Islamabad and Washington. He was swiftly transported under heavy guard to the central prison in Peshawar, a move designed to prevent any attempt at a jailbreak by his loyalists. The news made international headlines. The untouchable heroin kingpin had been captured. For the DEA and other global narcotics agencies, it was a watershed victory, a symbol that even the most powerful drug lords could fall. For the Pakistani government, it was a trophy to present to the international community, proof of their commitment to the war on drugs. But for Ayub Afridi, this was merely the opening move in a new kind of battle, a legal and political struggle where his wealth, his connections, and his deep knowledge of the system's corruptible points would become his new weapons. His empire had been dealt a crippling blow, but the man at its center was far from finished. The trial of Haji Ayub Afridi, which began in a specially convened anti-narcotic court in Peshawar, swiftly transformed from a straightforward criminal prosecution into a complex political and legal spectacle that laid bare the intricate, often shadowy, relationships between crime, state, and intelligence in Pakistan. The prosecution, armed with volumes of evidence painstakingly gathered by the DEA and Pakistani counterparts, including shipping manifests, financial records from seized assets, and testimonies from arrested couriers, presented a seemingly watertight case. They painted a picture of a vast, merciless empire that had profited from global suffering. The charge sheet was monumental, detailing specific instances of smuggling totaling thousands of kilograms, conspiracy to distribute, and money laundering. The world expected a quick conviction and a severe sentence, likely the death penalty, which was applicable for drug trafficking of this magnitude in Pakistan. However, Afridi's defense strategy was masterful and multidimensional, reflecting his deep understanding of the system. His legal team, comprising some of the most expensive and shrewd lawyers in the country, did not merely challenge the evidence. They attacked the very narrative and jurisdiction of the trial. They argued that their client was a legitimate businessman and a tribal elder, a philanthropist who had built schools and mosques, and that the charges were a politically motivated frame-up by foreign powers seeking a scapegoat for America's own domestic drug problem. More subtly and far more dangerously for the state, the defense hinted at the possibility of unveiling the uncomfortable truths of the 1980s. They insinuated that they could name names and present documents showing collaboration with state agencies during the Afghan Jihad, potentially embarrassing the powerful military and intelligence establishment. This was a veiled threat, not just a legal argument. It created immense behind-the-scenes pressure on the proceedings. Simultaneously, Afridi's network outside the courtroom swung into action. Vast sums of money were allegedly deployed to influence witnesses, some of whom mysteriously recanted their statements or failed to appear. Judges and prosecutors reported intense, indirect pressure. The atmosphere was thick with intimidation and whispered deals. Furthermore, Afridi leveraged his tribal power. Prominent elders from the Afridi tribe and other allied clans held press conferences and met with political leaders, framing his arrest not as a legal necessity but as a violation of tribal sovereignty and an insult to Pashtun honor, potentially threatening unrest in the already volatile tribal region. The trial dragged on for years, becoming a symbol of the immense difficulty in convicting a figure who existed at the intersection of criminal wealth, tribal authority, and historical state complicity. It was a stark demonstration that capturing a kingpin was one thing, but legally dismantling his legacy and the system that enabled him was an entirely different and far murkier battle. In a turn of events that stunned international observers but surprised few within Pakistan's cynical political landscape, Haji Ayub Afridi's legal impasse was ultimately broken not by a judicial verdict, but by the chaotic, transactional nature of the country's democracy. In 1993, after years of legal wrangling and with his trial still inconclusive, a general election brought a new government to power. The Prime Minister-elect, Benazir Bhutto, faced a nation rife with challenges, including immense pressure from the United States to demonstrate progress on counter-narcotics. However, she also confronted a fragile political coalition and the ever-present, dominant influence of the military establishment. It was in this convoluted context that a remarkable and highly controversial deal was struck. In 1994, the state abruptly withdrew its case against Afridi. The official rationale was nebulous, citing lack of evidence and the national interest. But the unspoken truth was a multifaceted bargain. For the new civilian government, releasing Afridi was a way to appease powerful tribal constituencies and certain elements within the military and intelligence apparatus who may have viewed his continued incarceration as a latent threat or an inconvenience. It also allowed Bhutto's administration to claim a fresh start, distancing itself from the murky alliances of the past. For the establishment, it was a way to quietly bury the potentially explosive revelations his continued trial might provoke. And for the United States, while publicly furious, there may have been a tacit, grim understanding that the alternative, a public trial airing the dirty laundry of the Afghan war, was a geopolitical nightmare to be avoided at all costs. Afridi walked out of prison a free man, his empire severely damaged but his legend magnified. He returned to the Tierra Valley not as a prisoner, but once again as a Malik, a chieftain whose power had been validated by his ability to defy the world's greatest superpower and its local proxies. He was poor in immediate assets. Many of his foreign accounts and properties had been seized or frozen, but infinitely richer in stature and street credibility. His release sent a devastating message that in the shadowy interplay between crime and state in this region, ultimate impunity was possible. He retreated to his mountainous stronghold, a sovereign in all but name, and began the slow, careful work of rebuilding. The global heroin trade, however, had not waited for him. New players, more violent and fragmented cartels from Mexico and Colombia, were rising, and the routes had shifted. Ayub Afridi's direct, hands-on empire was a thing of the past, but his knowledge, his network, and his mythos remained potent assets. He was now an elder statesman of the underworld, a symbol of resilience, and a living lesson in how to survive the collapse of the very system one had helped create. The final chapter of Haji Ayub Afridi's life, from his release in 1994 to his death in 2012, was one of paradoxical transformation, from global public enemy number one to a reclusive, yet influential, tribal patriarch navigating a world that had dramatically changed around him. He did not return to the heroin trade on its former imperial scale. The landscape had become too hostile, too monitored, and too competitive. The US had Pakistan under a microscope regarding narcotics, and the post-9/11 world had turned the tribal areas into a central theater in the war on terror, flooded with CIA drones and Pakistani military operations targeting Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Afridi was far too shrewd to operate in that glare. Instead, he pivoted. He consolidated his remaining wealth and influence into local and regional ventures. He became a major player in the cross-border trade of legal and grey market goods between Pakistan and Afghanistan, fuel, construction materials, vehicles, and consumer electronics, leveraging his unmatched knowledge of the smuggling routes. This trade, while lucrative, also kept him embedded in the essential economic lifeline of the region, maintaining his network of loyalists. More conspicuously, he embarked on a campaign of public philanthropy, constructing mosques, schools, and hospitals in the impoverished tribal areas. This was a classic move from the playbook of gangsters throughout history, seeking redemption and legitimacy through public works. But in the context of Pashtun society, it was also a genuine fulfillment of the tribal leader's duty to his people. He presented himself as a benevolent Malik, a resolver of disputes, a patron of the poor, and a pious Muslim. His home in the Tira Valley became a place of pilgrimage for politicians seeking tribal endorsements, journalists chasing his legend, and even, some reports suggest, clandestine meetings with intelligence officials who still valued his insights into the labyrinthine tribal dynamics. He was a living archive of a bygone era, a bridge between the covert war of the 1980s and the open conflict of the 2000s. However, the shadows of his past never fully receded. He remained on various international watch lists, and his movement were restricted. The myth of the Heroin King clung to him, a title he neither confirmed nor denied, adding to his enigmatic aura. In his later years, he suffered from diabetes and heart ailments, the physical toll of a life of immense stress and luxury. He witnessed the region he once ruled as a narcotics sovereign descend into a new kind of chaos as Taliban and Al-Qaeda militants moved in, bringing with them a brutal form of insurgency that challenged even the traditional tribal authority he represented. Ayub Afridi died of a heart attack on August 2, 2012, at his home in Peshawar. His funeral was a massive, somber affair, attended by thousands of tribesmen, politicians, and dignitaries, a testament to the complex, enduring legacy of a man who was simultaneously outlaw, a benefactor, product of his time, and a master of his destiny until the very end. The legacy of Haji Ayub Afridi is not a simple monument to crime or a straightforward tale of rise and fall. It is a sprawling, dark tapestry woven into the very fabric of modern geopolitical history, whose threads continue to shape realities far beyond the mountains of the Khyber Pass. His most immediate and devastating legacy was the institutionalization of the heroin trade. Before the Afridi Empire, opium production in the Golden Crescent was disparate and localized. He demonstrated the profitability of industrial-scale processing and globalized logistics, create a blueprint that countless successors would follow, albeit in more fractured and violent ways. The networks he established, the smuggling routes, the corruption protocols, the money laundering channels through Havala and real estate did not vanish with his arrest or death. They were inherited, adapted, and weaponized by a new generation of traffickers, militant groups like the Taliban and other criminal syndicates. The Taliban, in particular, would become masters of this inherited system, using opium profits to fund their insurgency, thus creating a direct, chilling lineage from the CIA-backed Mujahideen of the 1980s to the terrorists of the 2000s, with Afridi's operational model as the crucial link. On a human level, his legacy is measured in millions of ruined lives across the globe, addictions, overdoses, shattered families, and crime-ridden communities, a trail of destruction emanating from the decisions made in his mountain labs. For Pakistan and the tribal areas, his story is a permanent stain, a case study in how state expediency and short-term geopolitical gains can nurture a monster that ultimately threatens the state's own stability and international standing. He exposed the hollow core of sovereignty in the frontier regions and the Faustian bargains struck by intelligence agencies. Furthermore, his ability to evade ultimate justice through a combination of tribal power, legal maneuvering, and political deal-making entrenched a culture of impunity that plagues the region to this day, sending a clear message that connections and wealth can bend even the most serious legal frameworks. For the United States and the West, the Afridi saga remains one of the most profound examples of blowback, the unintended, toxic consequences of covert foreign policy. The very heroin that fueled a crisis in American cities was a direct byproduct of the war machine built to fight the Soviets. In this sense, Haji Ayub Afridi was less an author of history and more a monstrous, opportunistic creation of it, a character who understood the shadows of the great game better than the players themselves. His life force is a grim reflection on the interconnectedness of global politics, crime, and unintended consequence, proving that the seeds of future chaos are often sown in the hidden fields of present-day strategy. To understand the sheer, mind-numbing scale of Haji Ayub Afridi's operation, one must move beyond abstract terms like empire and confront the cold, hard statistics that define his infamy. The central, almost unbelievable figure that anchors his legend is the 29 tons of heroin attributed to his network. This is not a cumulative estimate over a decade, This was the quantity seized in a single gargantuan confiscation by Turkish authority in 1988 from a ship linked to his organization, a seizure that remains one of the largest in global history. To visualize 29 tons, imagine a line of heavy cargo trucks, each loaded to capacity, or the weight of nearly 5 adult African elephants. In street term, this single seizure represented over 29 million individual doses of pure heroin, with a potential retail value in the billions of dollars, enough to addict entire cities. But this was merely the tip of the iceberg, the one shipment that was caught. Law enforcement and intelligence agencies estimate that for every ton intercepted, several more reached their destination. Therefore, the total volume of heroin that passed through Afridi's logistical chain during his peak years in the late 1980s is calculated to be in the range of 150 to 200 tons. This volume gave him a staggering market share, controlling an estimated 40 to 50% of the entire heroin supply. Entering the United States at the height of the American crack and heroin epidemic, the financial architecture supporting this flow was equally colossal. While precise figures are impossible due to the cash-based, informal hawala system, experts conservatively estimate his network generated $2 to $3 billion in annual revenue at its zenith. This wealth did not sit in bank accounts. It was a fluid, kinetic force. It purchased fleets of vehicles, financed laboratories, paid salary to thousands from chemists to armed guards, and graced the palm of officials at every level of the Pakistani state, from lowly customs clerks to senior politicians and intelligence officers. It funded the construction of palatial homes in Peshawar and sprawling fortresses in the tribal areas. It also bought political capital, as Afridi became a crucial financier for certain political campaigns and a benefactor whose philanthropy built mosques and schools, weaving him into the social fabric. This scale of operation required a small army. His core organization consisted of several hundred trusted tribesmen and family members managing logistics, security, and finance, but the wider network included farmers, couriers, lab workers, corrupt officials, and international distributors, encompassed several thousand individuals across multiple continents. He operated not as a lone wolf, but as the CEO of a decentralized, multinational corporation with a ruthless efficiency that would rival any Fortune 500 company. These numbers, 29 tons, 50% market share, billions in revenue, are not just metric of crime. They are the quantitative proof of a seismic event in the underworld, a benchmark against which all other drug lords would be measured, and a chilling testament to the industrial capacity for evil that can be unlocked when criminal genius meets historical opportunity. Beneath the staggering statistics and geopolitical narratives lies the essential human core of Haji Ayub Afridi's story, the complex, contradictory character of the man himself. To paint him merely as a monster is to miss the nuanced persona that allowed him to navigate such disparate worlds. By all accounts from those who knew him, Afridi was a study in contrasts. In person, he was described as soft-spoken, charismatic, and fiercely intelligent, with a commanding presence that demanded respect without raising his voice. He was a devout Muslim who observed his prayers faithfully and performed the Hajj pilgrimage, earning the honorific Haji. He was a staunch adherent to the Pashtunwali code, where his word was his bond, and he was known for extravagant hospitality, welcoming guests, whether poor tribesmen or powerful officials, with equal generosity. This genuine piety and traditional honor were not a facade. They were integral to his identity and a key source of his local legitimacy. Yet, this was the same man who presided over an enterprise that caused incalculable suffering, addiction, and death thousands of miles away. A disconnect he either rationalized or ignored. He reportedly viewed the heroin trade through a detached, almost amoral economic lens. In one purported interview, he is said to have shrugged off moral responsibility, stating, "If I didn't do it, someone else would. The demand is in your countries, not mine." This mindset reflects the frontier realism of the tribal areas, where survival and clan prosperity often trump abstract moralities imposed by distant governments. He saw himself not as a poisoner of youth, but as a provider of jobs in a war-ravaged economy, a provider of revenue for his tribe, and a provider of a service to a hungry international market. His personal life was equally dualistic. He lived in austere fortresses in the mountains, yet enjoyed the luxuries his wealth could buy. He was a family man, deeply involved in the lives of his children and grandchildren, arranging marriage and seeking education for them. Even as he operated in a world of extreme violence and betrayal, he could be brutally ruthless when crossed, ordering executions of informants or rival traffickers, yet he was also known to settle tribal disputes with Solomon-like wisdom and dispense charity to the destitute. This duality is what made him so formidable and so difficult to categorize. He was not a flamboyant, Scarface-style villain. He was a quiet, calculating patriarch whose power stemmed from understanding people, systems, and the gray zones between legality and tradition. He embodied the ultimate contradiction, a man of deep local honor who built a global empire of dishonor, a pious Muslim who profited from one of Islam's greatest prohibitions, and a proactive tribal insularity who became a player on the world stage. To understand Haji Ayub Afridi is to understand that in the right or wrong historical circumstances, profound human contradictions can be amplified to a world historic scale. The downfall of a criminal empire as vast as Afridi's is never the result of a single flaw, but rather a catastrophic convergence of internal pressures and external forces. While the shifting geopolitics provided the primary catalyst, critical weaknesses had begun to appear within Afridi's own meticulously constructed domain. The first was the inherent instability of an empire built on a foundation of tribal alliances. These alliances were not corporate mergers, but fragile pacts based on honor, mutual benefit, and constant revenue sharing. As the profits reached astronomical levels, jealousy festered. Rival sub-clans within the broader Afridi tribe and competing tribes like the Shimbari or Kadak began to resent his dominance. They saw the fleets of new trucks, the construction projects, and the political access, and coveted a larger piece of the pie. This internal competition sometimes erupted into violent skirmishes over control of specific smuggling routes or lab locations, forcing Afridi to expend resources on internal security rather than external expansion. Secondly, the very scale of his operation became a vulnerability. The containerized shipping method, while efficient, created a pattern. International narcotics agencies, by painstakingly mapping his logistical routes from the primitive labs in Khyber to the port of Karachi to Pacific shipping lines and European ports of entry, began to identify a signature. His reliance on a relatively small cadre of trusted international partners like the Turkish networks created a single point of failure. When the DEA and Turkish police flipped one of these key partners, the entire European distribution chain was laid bare, leading to the catastrophic seizures that crippled his cash flow. Thirdly, Afridi's legendary political protection developed cracks. The individuals he had bribed and cultivated within the Pakistani bureaucracy and military were not permanent fixtures. Postings changed, governments fell, and new officials arrived who were not part of the original bargain and were under intense new international scrutiny. The political capital he had spent so lavishly was a depreciating asset. Furthermore, his vast wealth made him a target for extortion from within the very state apparatus that protected him. Some intelligence and military officials, seeing his empire wobble under international pressure, may have decided to cut their losses and squeeze him for one final payout before his inevitable fall, further straining his resources and trust. Finally, there was the human factor of overreach and perhaps a touch of hubris. Surviving the Afghan jihad era unscathed might have bred a sense of invincibility, a belief that the system he had manipulated would always bend to his will. This could explain why, even as the global anti-drug pressure mounted in the late 1980s, he continued to operate on such a brazenly massive scale, moving multi-ton shipments as if the golden age of impunity would never end. He failed to fully anticipate that his utility to the state had an expiration date tied directly to the end of the Cold War. In the end, Haji Ayub Afridi was not brought down by a superior criminal rival or a lone heroic agent, but by a perfect storm, the drying up of his geopolitical shield, the betrayal of his own scaled-up business model, the fickleness of his corrupt alliances, and the relentless, patient pressure of a global law enforcement network that finally connected the dots he had so carefully scattered across the world. The capture and subsequent release of Haji Ayub Afridi ignited a fierce, ongoing debate that strikes at the heart of justice, geopolitics, and morality. Was he truly defeated? On the surface, The narrative suggests a victory for law enforcement. The world's most powerful heroin trafficker was arrested, his network disrupted, his assets targeted, and he spent years in legal limbo before living out his days in a form of internal exile. The DEA and international partners had notched a historic win, yet a deeper examination reveals a far more ambiguous outcome, one that many argue represents not a defeat, but a negotiated stalemate, or even a strategic victory for Afridi in the long game of survival. Consider the facts of his punishment. He was never convicted on the monumental charges against him. He avoided the death penalty. He secured his freedom through a political deal, not a legal exoneration, walking out of prison with his life, his tribal authority intact, and a significant portion of his localized power and wealth preserved. He died as a free man in his own bed, surrounded by family and mourned by thousands, not on a gallows or in a solitary supermax cell, by the brutal calculus of the narcotics world where lifespan is often short and ends violently. This constitutes a remarkable success. Furthermore, the system that created and protected him was never truly held to account. The intelligence agencies, corrupt officials, and political structures that were complicit in his rise faced no reckoning. The trial that threatened to expose them was quietly terminated in the national interest. In this sense, Afridi's release was a mutual non-aggression pact between a criminal and a state, each agreeing to bury the secrets of the past. For his tribal constituency, his outcome was a triumph. He had stood against the full force of the Pakistani state and the American superpower, and had not been broken. He returned to them his honor, not only intact but burnished by the ordeal, a symbol of Pashtun resistance against external coercion. On the global stage, however, his legacy is one of profound failure for the war on drugs. His empire demonstrated that the drug trade is a hydra, cut off one head and others grow. Often more vicious and decentralized, the heroin flows from Afghanistan continued unabated after his decline, now funding worse actors like the Taliban. The addiction epidemics he helped fuel raged on. So, was he defeated? The legal and law enforcement apparatus would say yes. The geopolitical realists might say it was a messy draw. The people of the tribal areas might claim a moral victory, and the ghosts of his countless victims would scream a silent, perpetual no. The true answer lies in this unresolved tension, proving that in the shadowy realm where crime and state power intersect, concepts like victory and defeat are rarely absolute, but are instead shades of gray, negotiated in backrooms and measured in compromised principles and ongoing suffering. To fully grasp the phenomenon of Haji Ayub Afridi, one must look beyond the map and examine the unique ecosystem that produced him. The federally administered tribal areas, FETA, of Pakistan, a land that functioned under a legal and social code separate from the modern world until very recently. This was not merely a remote region, it was a stateless space, governed by the British-era Frontier Crimes Regulation, FCR, a draconian set of laws that imposed collective punishment on tribes but offered few state services. The Pakistani state's authority here was symbolic, mediated through political agents and tribal maliks. Into this vacuum flowed the ancient, unwavering code of Pashtunwali. This code centered on Nanavatai, asylum, Badal revenge, Milmastia, hospitality, and Nang honor, created a parallel sovereignty. Loyalty was to the clan, not the constitution. Justice was dispensed through jirgas, tribal councils, not courts. This environment was the perfect incubator for a figure like Afridi. Smuggling was not seen as a crime against the state, but as a savvy, even honorable, profession, a way to defy artificially imposed borders, the Duran line between Pakistan and Afghanistan, and provide for the tribe. The state was viewed not as a protector, but as a predatory, distant entity to be manipulated, bribed, or resisted. When Afridi built his empire, he was operating within this value system, provided Milmastia, jobs, protection, charity. He ensured Nang tribal prestige and power. He could offer Nanavatai protection to those in his network. His battles with the state were seen through the prism of Badal and tribal defense. This is why his arrest was viewed by many tribesmen not as the capture of a criminal, but as an attack on their sovereignty and a humiliation of their malik. The state's inability to fully penetrate this ecosystem was Afridi's greatest strategic asset. The mountains provided physical cover, but Pashtunwali provided the ideological and social armor. Every official sent from Islamabad was an outsider to be gamed. Every law was an alien concept to be subverted. Afridi was not an anomaly in this landscape, he was its ultimate expression. He mastered the delicate dance of being both a traditional tribal leader, bound by ancient codes, and a modern, global criminal entrepreneur. He used the state's weakness, its lack of legitimate authority, as his strength, and he used the tribe's strength, its insular loyalty, as his fortress. His story is impossible to understand without this context. He was not a Colombian cartel boss operating within a functioning state he sought to corrupt. He was a feudal lord operating in a stateless territory where he was the state for all practical purposes. The tribal areas were not just his hiding place, they were his kingdom, his identity, and the source of the unbreakable social contract that allowed his empire to rise and ensured his legend would endure long after his death. The international manhunt for Haji Ayub Afridi stands as a landmark case in the annals of global narcotics enforcement, a complex, multi-agents endeavor that pioneered techniques and exposed the severe limitations of cross-border pursuit in an era before seamless intelligence sharing. The effort was spearheaded by the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, which had placed Afridi at the pinnacle of its consolidated priority organization target list, but it involved an unlikely coalition. American DEA agents, Turkish National Police, Italian and mafia units, British customs officials, and Pakistan's own anti-narcotics force and intelligence bureau. The investigation was a monumental exercise in connecting microscopic dots across continents. It began not in the mountains of Tehran, but in the streets of New York, London, and Istanbul, where street-level seizures of high-purity heroin were traced back through distribution chains. DEA agents, using phone taps and undercover informants, painstakingly worked their way up the ladder from low-level dealers to European distributors, eventually hearing the whispered name Haji Ayub or the king from Khyber. Parallel to this, financial investigators tracked the movement of vast sums through the Hawala system, a nearly impossible task that required cultivating sources within the close-knit networks of money changers in the Gulf and South Asia. The breakthrough often came from interdiction. The 1988 seizure of the 29-ton shipment in Turkey was catastrophic for Afridi's network, but a goldmine for investigators. The ship's manifest, the packaging, the chemical signature of the heroin, and the arrested crew members provided a roadmap. This data was cross-referenced with other large seizures in Europe, revealing patterns in routing, packaging, and modus operandi. Intelligence agencies, including the CIA, provided satellite imagery and signals intelligence, mapping the suspect laboratory compounds and communication patterns in the tribal areas. However, the investigation was hamstrung by profound obstacles. The most significant was the sovereign impenetrability of Pakistan's tribal areas. DEA agents could not operate there. They were confined to Islamabad and Peshawar, relying on their Pakistan counterparts, whose loyalty and effectiveness were often compromised by corruption or fear. The political protection Afridi enjoyed meant that tips about his movements or operations would mysteriously fail to pan out, or raids would be conducted on empty facilities after clear warnings were leaked. The other major hurdle was the wall of silence erected by Pashtunwali. Cultivating an informant within Afridi's tribe was considered nearly impossible and lethal. Dangerous. Betrayal meant certain death for the informant and potentially his entire family. The manhunt, therefore, became an exercise in external pressure and patience. The strategy shifted from hoping for a direct inside source to systematically dismantling his international logistics and applying overwhelming diplomatic pressure on the Pakistani government to act. It was a war of attrition against his empire's peripheries, designed to collapse it from the outside in, because its core, the man and his mount fortress, remained inviolable until the geopolitical calculus changed and the state decided, for its own reasons, to withdraw its shield. Haji Ayub Afridi's story is irrevocably intertwined with a darker, more elusive narrative, the alleged involvement of powerful state intelligence agencies, most notably Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence, ESI, and the American Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. In the narcotics trade of the 1980s, this is not the stuff of conspiracy theory, but a subject of serious investigation by journalists, congressional committees, and historians. The core of the allegation is stark: to fund the Afghan Mujahideen war against the Soviets. Elements within these agencies turn a blind eye to, or even actively facilitated, the opium and heroin trade, seeing it as a necessary evil to sustain the resistance. Mujahideen commanders, needing cash to buy weapons not supplied by the CIA, heavily taxed opium farmers and traffickers in areas they controlled. The labs that processed the opium into morphine base often operated in the Pakistan tribal areas under the protection of local authorities tied to the EISI. Afridi, with his existing smuggling network and tribal clout, became a logical, if unofficial, partner in this ecosystem. He provided a service, moving the product out, and, crucially, bringing weapons and money in. The protection he enjoyed was therefore not merely bought with bribes, but earned through strategic utility. Declassified documents and testimonies, such as those from former CIA operative Charles Cogan, acknowledge the more compromise, with Cogan famously stating, "Our main mission was to do as much damage as possible to the Soviets. We didn't really have the resources or the time to devote to an investigation of the drug trade." For the ISI, the calculus was even more direct. The heroin trade funded their proxy forces, created patronage networks to control the tribal areas, and generated black funds for off-the-books operation. Afridi's genius was to insert himself into the very center of this tacit arrangement. He became a deniable asset, a valve in the pipeline. This relationship explains the surreal nature of his arrest and trial. His capture in 1991 came only after the Soviet withdrawal, when his utility had expired and his notoriety had become a liability. The aborted trial and his eventual release in 1994 further suggest a behind-the-scenes bargain to prevent a public airing of these covert alliances. The state could not afford to let Afridi, in a desperate defense, unveil the full tapestry of connections between the heroin trade and the jihadist infrastructure it had helped build. This chapter is the most controversial and morally fraught aspect of his saga. It positions Haji Ayub Afridi not merely as a criminal entrepreneur, but as a grotesque byproduct and a willing participant in a covert war where the lines between freedom fighter, intelligence asset, and drug lord were deliberately and catastrophically blurred. His empire stands as a permanent, grim monument to the doctrine that the ends justify the means, and his survival is a testament to the enduring power of the secret he helped keep. The sheer magnitude of wealth generated by Haji Ayub Afridi's empire posed a problem as complex as the smuggling itself. How to launder and conceal billions of dollars in a predominantly cash-based, underdeveloped region. His financial architecture was a hybrid masterpiece, blending ancient, trust-based system with modern capitalist tools, all designed to leave the faintest possible paper trail. The primary engine was the Hawala system. Billion-dollar payments from European and American distributors would be given to a Hawaladar money changer in, say, New York or London. That Hawaladar would then contact his counterpart in Peshawar or Karachi via a simple phone call or fax using a code word. The counterpart in Pakistan would then dispense the equivalent in Pakistan, rupees or dollars, from his own reserves to Afridi's representatives. No physical money crossed borders, no banks were involved, and the only record was a single cryptic ledger entry that was often destroyed. This system was fast, reliable, and invisible to Western financial monitoring. The cash that accumulated in Pakistan then needed to be legitimized. Afridi invested heavily in the booming real estate markets of Peshawar and Karachi. He would purchase vast tracts of agricultural land, commercial plazas, and residential apartments through front men and shell companies, often at inflated prices, effectively pumping his illicit cash into the legitimate economy. He also invested in transportation, owning fleets of trucks and buses for his cross-border trade, which provided both a cover for logistics and a way to account for cash flow. Another significant outlet was the import-export business. He would over-invoice for legitimate imports, like electronics or machinery, paying his foreign suppliers with illicit funds abroad, and the suppliers would kick back the excess. Conversely, he would under-invoice exports, with a foreign buyer paying the full price into an offshore account controlled by Afridi. Gold and precious gems, easily transported and holding value across borders, were another favorite medium. Perhaps his most socially strategic investment was in philanthropy and political patronage. Building mosques, schools, and hospitals not only bought local goodwill and religious merit, but also provided a perfect way to explain large expenditures of cash. Contractors would be paid in bundles of notes for construction, with no questions asked. Similarly, financing political campaigns for amenable candidates, again with untraceable cash, purchased invaluable protection and influence. He maintained a relatively austere personal lifestyle compared to the flamboyant cartel bosses of Latin America, avoiding flashy yachts or foreign villas that would draw attention. His wealth was stored in the ground in the form of land and in the loyalty of his people. This decentralized, multi-pronged approach made it nearly impossible for financial investigators to follow the money trail to its source. They could see the symptoms, the sudden real estate acquisitions by obscure tribesmen, the lavish charitable projects in poor areas but proving the direct link to heroin profits. Buried under layers of tribal loyalty and opaque transaction was a task that ultimately proved as formidable as capturing the man himself. The physical and human geography of the Khyber Pass and the surrounding tribal territories was not merely the setting for Haji Ayub Afridi's empire. It was an active, enabling character in the drama, a partner in crime forged by millennia of conflict and isolation. This landscape is one of the most formidable on earth. A chaotic jumble of razor-edged mountains, deep, shadowy ravines, and labyrinthine dry riverbeds called nullahs. The passes are narrow, easily defended, and number in the hundreds, known fully only to generations of local tribesmen. For centuries, this terrain has repelled empires, from the British to the Soviets. For Afridi, it was a perfect logistical sanctuary. His laboratories were not built in fixed industrial compounds but in portable, camouflaged setups within these remote valleys or caves, moved frequently to avoid detection. The smuggling routes were not roads but ancient footpaths and goat trails, negotiable only by sure-footed mules and four-wheel drive vehicles driven by experts. These routes formed a spider web across the Durand Line, the porous border, with Afghanistan making it a line on a map but not a reality on the ground. His spotters, positioned on high ridges with telescopic sights and satellite phones long before they were common, could monitor the movement of any security forces for miles, giving his convoys ample time to vanish into a side canyon or hide in one of countless natural caves. The human geography was equally crucial. The tribal social structure, based on the Kalang fortified village and clan loyalty, meant every stranger was instantly identified. A government informant or undercover agent stood out like a beacon and would be reported within minutes. This created an intelligence vacuum for outsiders and an impenetrable surveillance web for Afridi. The villages themselves were fortresses, with high walls and watchtowers often interlinked through kinship, forming a defensive archipelago across the mountains. Furthermore, the region's economy was traditionally based on transport, trade, and smuggling. It was a skill set passed down through generations. Every tribesman knew how to pack a mule for balance, how to read the weather in the passes, and how to negotiate with customs officials. Afridi did not need to recruit specialists. He was drawing from a deep cultural well of expertise. The climate also played a role. Harsh winters would close some passes, dictating the timing of large shipments, while the dry summers allowed for movement across otherwise impassable terrain. This intimate, symbiotic relationship with the land is what made Afridi and others like him so resilient. He wasn't hiding in the mountains, he was of the mountains. The landscape provided not just cover, but also a mindset, a tradition of autonomy, a deep suspicion of central authority, and a profound understanding that in this rock and dust, power flowed not from legal documents, but from control of the routes, the loyalty of the clans, and the secrets of the paths that snaked through the bones of the earth. To defeat him, one would have had to conquer the geography itself, a task that had humbled the world's greatest armies for centuries. The cultural and social impact of Haji Ayub Afridi's wealth within the rigid, honor-bound society of the Pashtun tribal areas was profound and deeply paradoxical. creating a lasting legacy that transcends his criminality. In a region defined by poverty, limited state services, and a fierce pride in self-reliance, the sudden influx of billions of dollars from the heroin trade acted as a seismic economic and social shock. Afridi, adhering to the Pashtunwali tenet of Milmastia, hospitality and generosity, became a colossal patron. He funded the construction of grand, marble-clad mosques and madrasas, which served not only as places of worship, but also as community centers and symbols of renewed tribal prestige. He built schools and basic healthcare clinics in areas where the government had provided none. Winning the genuine gratitude of a population long neglected by Islamabad, he paved roads connecting remote villages, indirectly aiding his logistics but also bringing unprecedented connectivity. For the local young men, his empire provided employment as drivers, guards, lab workers, or couriers, offering income far beyond subsistence farming or labor migration. This created a form of dependency. Thousands of families directly or indirectly relied on the heroin economy he curated. However, this philanthropy was a double-edged sword. It distorted traditional economies. Why farm wheat for pennies when you could guard a poppy field or a lab for dollars? It also exacerbated social inequalities, creating a new class of flashy, gun-toting nouveau rich among the tribesmen, which upset the traditional, more austere social hierarchy led by elders and meliks. The sudden wealth also fueled intra-tribal and intertribal conflicts as rivals fought over control of the lucrative trade routes Afridi had pioneered. Furthermore, the corrosive influence of such massive, easy money began to erode the very fabric of Pashtun Mali. The code's emphasis on honor and fairness was strained by the brutal realities of the drug trade betrayals, assassinations of informants, and ruthless business practices. While Afridi himself maintained a posture of a traditional Malik, the system he built encouraged greed and violence over the communal balance the code was meant to uphold. His legacy, therefore, is a complex tapestry. To many in his community, he remains a revered figure. Haji Sahib, the benevolent patriarch who brought development and respect when the state did not. They separate the man, the provider, the dispute resolver, the pious Hajj pilgrim from the global consequences of his trade, which they never witnessed. To the outside world, this is a stark moral contradiction, but within the context of the tribal areas, it underscores a harsh truth. When a state fails to provide justice, services, or economic dignity, its citizens will find alternative patrons, and they will judge those patrons by the immediate, tangible benefits they bring to their doorstep, not by their distant sins. Afridi filled a vacuum, and in doing so, etched his name not only in the annals of crime but also in the social memory of his people as a contradictory symbol of both shame and providence. The death of Haji Ayub Afridi in 2012 did not mark the end of his story, but rather its transmutation from lived history into enduring myth, and its grim reverberations continue to shape global narcotics dynamics and regional instability today. His myth serves multiple, often conflicting purposes for aspiring traffickers in the region. He is the ultimate success story, the poor tribesman who outsmarted superpowers and died rich and free in his own bed, a template for ambition, albeit a dangerously romanticized one. For local tribesmen, he's a folk hero, a Robin Hood figure who defied a predatory state and redistributed wealth through patronage, his criminality softened by time and the tangible benefits he left behind. For law enforcement, he remains the benchmark of scale, a case study in both investigative triumph and systemic failure, a reminder of the hydra-like nature of the drug trade. But his most concrete legacy is the operational blueprint he left for the Taliban. In the 1990s, and especially after the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, the Taliban inherited and perfected the heroin infrastructure Afridi helped pioneer. They institutionalized opium taxation, protected labs, and systematized smuggling routes, transforming drug revenue into the primary financial engine of their insurgency. The networks of corruption Afridi cultivated within Pakistani logistics and officialdom likely facilitated later Taliban operations. In this sense, the blowback from the 1980s came full circle. The trade that funded the anti-Soviet jihad later funded the anti-American and anti-Pakistani jihad. Furthermore, The model of state criminal collusion he exemplified persists. While no single figure has likely matched his monolithic control, the fragmentation of the trade has made it more resilient and violent, with various militant groups, criminal syndicates, and corrupt officials all taking a piece. The tribal areas he once ruled have descended into even greater chaos, torn between the Pakistani military, various Taliban factions, and ISIS affiliates, with opium and heroin remaining the universal currency of conflict. Internationally, the demand for heroin evolved, with crises like the opioid epidemic in North America driven partly by prescription drugs but also by the steady, reliable supply of cheap heroin from Afghanistan, a supply chain whose modern efficiency owes a debt to the industrial template Afridi established. His life forces us to confront the long arc of unintended consequences. The geopolitical decisions of the late 20th century, made in distant capitals, created Haji Ayub Afridi. His actions, in turn, helped create a financial and logistical architecture that continued to fuel conflict, addiction, and corruption deep into the 21st century. He was both a creator and a creature of his times, and the world he helped shape is one we are still struggling to navigate, proving that the ghosts of empires, whether of nation-states or of crime, linger long after their founders have turned to dust. And so, as the dust settles on the saga of Haji Ayub Afridi, we are left not with a simple moral, but with a constellation of uncomfortable truths that force us to stare into the abyss where crime, war, and statecraft intersect. His story is a mirror held up to the hypocrisies of power. It reveals how the noble cause of freedom fighting can be fatally poisoned by the means employed to fund it, birthing monsters that outlive their geopolitical utility. It demonstrates that the war on drugs is often a chaotic, contradictory battle where today's target was yesterday's asset, and victory is measured in compromised deals and silenced courtrooms rather than eradicated vice. Afridi's life asks us a harrowing question. Who bears greater responsibility? The trafficker who meets a market demand, or the state actors who, in pursuit of higher strategic goals, create the conditions for that trafficker to become an untouchable king? His narrative dismantles the clean dichotomy of good versus evil, presenting instead a world of pervasive gray, where a man can be, with devastating consistency, both a pious community pillar and a global merchant of death. His enduring legacy in the tribal areas, the schools, the mosques, the roads built with blood money stands as a permanent indictment of state failure, a proof that people will pledge loyalty to whoever provides, regardless of the source. For us, the audience living in a world still grappling with the aftershocks of the Afghan jihad and the relentless global drug trade, his tale is a crucial cautionary fable. It warns of the law of unintended consequences, which dictates that the hidden costs of covert wars and short-term alliances will eventually come due with compound interest in the form of addiction epidemics, hardened criminal networks, and emboldened insurgents. It reminds us that geography and culture are not mere backdrops, but active determinants of history, and that empire can be built in the most remote mountain valleys, invisible to the world until their product floods its streets. Haji Ayub Afridi is gone, but the mountains of the Khyber remain. The demand for oblivion remains. The temptation for states to use dark means for light ends remains. And so, the essential conditions that created the Afghan Heroin King persist. His story is not a closed chapter but a dark preface to an ongoing crisis. It challenges us to look beyond the sensational headlines of kingpins and seizures and to examine the deeper, systemic illnesses that allow such figures to rise, thrive, and become legends. In the end, we must remember him not to glorify his empire, but to understand its origins, for in that understanding lies the only fragile hope of preventing the rise of the next Haji Ayub Afridi from the shadows of the next great game. If this journey into the heart of a real-life empire of shadows has held your attention, if it had made you think about the hidden connections that shape our world, then your engagement is crucial. Share this knowledge. Discuss it. Question the simple narratives. The power of understanding history lies in our willingness to confront its complexities. So, I urge you, hit the like button if this story resonated. Subscribe to this channel for more deep dives into the untold stories that shape our reality, and ring the notification bell so you never miss a truth that others might want to keep hidden? In the comments below, let me know. In the tale of Haji Ayub Afridi, who do you believe holds the ultimate responsibility? The man, the system, or the circumstances? Your perspective is part of the ongoing story. Thank you for listening.